The city burned around her. Cersei Lannister clutched her belly, staggering through the crumbling Red Keep as the sky rained fire. The distant roars of Daenerys's dragon echoed through the ruins, each blast sending another shockwave of destruction. Through the castle she had once ruled, smoke filled her lungs, and with every breath panic clawed its way deeper into her chest. She wasn't ready to die. She had always imagined her death would be dignified, surrounded by her legacy, with Jaime at her side, not like this, not choking on ash and desperation, hunted like a rat in the maze of her own making. The hallways twisted before her as she searched for an escape route. Blood dripped from a wound she hadn't even registered, mixing with the dust and grime clinging to her once pristine gown. "Jaime," she rasped, her voice drowned out by the destruction around her. He would come. He had to come. But as she stumbled into the shadows of the collapsing corridor, she saw someone waiting for her. Not Jaime. A girl stepped forward, small and wiry, her face streaked with soot. Her dark, piercing eyes locked onto Cersei with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. In her hand she gripped a dagger, its steel catching the flickering glow of the fires outside. Cersei recognized her instantly. Arya Stark. The girl she had once dismissed as nothing. The girl whose family she had destroyed, whose brother had been paraded before her like a trophy. "You," Cersei breathed, backing away. Her heart pounded in her chest, but there was nowhere left to run. Arya took a slow step forward. "You thought you'd get to die in his arms?" she asked softly. The words were barely above a whisper, but they carried more weight than any battle cry. Cersei shook her head. "No, please. You don't understand," she stammered, her breath hitching. "My child." Arya's eyes darkened. "Your child? Like my mother, my father, my brothers?" Her voice was laced with ice. "Did you hesitate when you ordered their deaths?" Cersei's lips parted, but no words came. She had always been quick with lies, but in that moment, none would come. Because there was nothing left to say. Arya moved like a shadow, swift and silent. Before Cersei could scream, the dagger plunged forward. Cersei gasped as Arya's dagger pressed against her stomach, the cold steel biting through her gown. The queen's breath came in short, frantic bursts, her mind scrambling for a way out. "No," she whispered, barely able to hear her own voice over the collapsing castle around them. Arya's grip was steady, her face expressionless. Cersei had seen many killers in her lifetime, commanded them even, but none frightened her like this girl. There was no anger in Arya's eyes, no hatred, no triumph. Just the stillness of death itself. The ground trembled as another section of the Red Keep collapsed behind them, sending a fresh wave of dust into the air. Cersei coughed, her body trembling, but Arya didn't move. "Do you hear that?" Arya asked, tilting her head slightly as if listening to the cries outside. "That's the sound of your city burning." Cersei forced herself to lift her chin, trying to summon the queen she had been just hours ago. "I am the Queen of the Seven Kingdoms," she said, her voice weaker than she intended. "If you kill me, you—" Arya's blade pressed harder, silencing her. "You were the queen," Arya corrected. "Now you're just another name on my list." Cersei's blood turned to ice. The list. She had heard whispers of it, a ghost story among the surviving Lannister soldiers. A list of names spoken into the night by a Stark girl, a girl who had trained with assassins, a girl who had already killed the Night King. "Please," Cersei tried again, her voice breaking. "Not for me. For my child." She wrapped her arms around her belly, her last desperate attempt at mercy. Arya's gaze didn't waver. "You mean the way you spared my father?" she asked, voice flat. Or my brother? Cersei's lips parted, but no excuse, no manipulation, no royal decree could stop the inevitable. A scream echoed through the halls as the ceiling cracked above them. The castle was falling apart, time running out. But Arya didn't move. She just whispered 2 words. Valor Morghulis. And then she struck. The dagger plunged forward. Cersei gasped, her body jerking as the blade sank into her stomach. A sharp, searing pain spread through her, stealing the breath from her lungs. She staggered, her hands grasping desperately at Arya's wrist, her fingers trembling. "No!" she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. Arya twisted the blade. Cersei let out a strangled cry, her knees buckling as her body slammed against the crumbling stone wall. Blood seeped between her fingers as she clutched at the wound, her mind reeling in disbelief. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. She was Cersei Lannister. She was supposed to die in Jaime's arms. Not like this. Not here in the dark at the hands of a Stark girl. Arya stepped back, her face unreadable as she watched the once mighty queen slump to the floor. "You don't get to choose how you die," Arya said, her voice quiet but merciless. "None of us did. Not my father, not my mother, not my brother. You stole that choice from them. I'm just here to make sure you don't steal it from anyone else." Cersei's vision blurred. Her breaths came in short, wet gasps, and she could feel the warmth of her own blood pooling beneath her. Her fingers clawed at the cold stone as if she could pull herself away from death through sheer force of will. Somewhere in the distance, the Red Keep groaned under its own weight. The walls cracked. The floors trembled. The world was collapsing around her, and she had never felt so small. Jaime. She thought of him, of the last time she had seen him, of the way he had always been there for her, even when he shouldn't have been, but he wasn't here now. She was alone. Arya stood over her, watching, waiting, but not with cruelty. There was no gloating, no satisfaction, just silence. Cersei's lips trembled as she tried to speak, but all that came out was a broken gasp. She had nothing left. No final words, no last act of defiance. Just the slow creeping darkness swallowing her whole. Arya turned and walked away, disappearing into the smoke as the Red Keep collapsed around the body of the woman who had once ruled the 7 kingdoms. The world around Arya shook as she stepped over Cersei's body. The once mighty queen lay slumped against the cold stone, her golden hair matted with dust and blood. Her eyes, wide with shock, stared blankly at nothing. There was no victory in her death, no grand battle, no final speech. Just the end of a woman who had thought herself untouchable. Arya didn't linger. She had seen enough death to know that staying too long near it made no difference. The dead couldn't hear apologies. They couldn't answer for their sins. And they certainly didn't care if you stayed to watch them go. The Red Keep trembled violently, a fresh burst of fire roaring from the sky as Drogon unleashed another wave of destruction. The walls cracked, groaning under the weight of the onslaught. Smoke thickened in the corridors, making it nearly impossible to breathe. Arya pulled her scarf over her mouth and moved quickly. She had come here for a reason. Not just to kill Cersei, but to make sure she lived long enough to leave the city behind. The staircase ahead was littered with bodies, gold-cloaked guards, noblemen, servants who had tried to escape. Some had been crushed by falling debris, others burned by the dragon fire raging outside. The stench of death clung to the air, mixing with the acrid smoke. She climbed over them, her body moving on instinct. The rage that had fueled her for so long was beginning to dull, leaving only exhaustion in its wake. She had done what she came to do. Cersei Lannister was dead. The city was burning, and yet something gnawed at her. A hollowness. A question she couldn't quite name. Was this it? Was this what vengeance felt like? A sudden explosion rocked the castle, sending Arya sprawling forward. She landed hard against the stone, pain shooting through her side. Dust rained down from the ceiling as another section of the Red Keep collapsed behind her, sealing the path she had just come through. She coughed, pushing herself up. The only way out now was forward. With a grimace, she pressed on, her muscles screaming with every step. She didn't look back. Cersei was gone. There was no point in looking back. The heat was unbearable. Arya moved through the collapsing Red Keep, her breath shallow, her body screaming for rest. Every corridor she turned down was filled with rubble or engulfed in flames. Smoke burned her eyes, her throat raw from inhaling ash. The city was dying, and if she didn't move faster, she would die with it. She stumbled over a broken column, her body nearly giving out beneath her. Blood smeared her hands from fresh cuts, but she barely noticed. She had been through worse. She had survived worse. A sudden scream echoed through the ruins, not from a soldier, not from a warrior, a child. Arya's head snapped up. Through the thick smoke, she spotted movement. A small figure, no more than 8 or 9, trapped beneath fallen beams. Beside her, a woman, possibly her mother, struggled to lift the debris, sobbing as fire crept closer. For a moment, Arya hesitated. She had come here for one reason, to kill Cersei. That mission was over. She could escape now, but something inside her twisted. She saw her own mother in that woman. She saw herself in that child. Without thinking, Arya ran forward. She ignored the fire licking at the walls, the embers that singed her skin. She gritted her teeth and grabbed the edge of the fallen beam. It was heavy, too heavy for one person, but she forced every ounce of strength into lifting it. The mother gasped, realizing what Arya was doing. With renewed desperation, she pushed against the rubble alongside her. For a moment it seemed impossible. Then, with a final, painful heave, the beam shifted just enough for the child to scramble free. The mother grabbed her daughter and pulled her into a tight embrace, sobbing into her hair. Arya staggered back, her arms trembling. "Go," she rasped, her voice barely audible over the roar of flames. The woman looked up at her, eyes wide with shock, as if she recognized Arya, not by name but by something deeper. Some unspoken connection between survivors. She nodded quickly, then pulled her daughter by the hand, disappearing down the smoke-filled corridor. Arya exhaled, her head spinning. She could have left them to die, but she didn't. She turned and ran, her mind racing. She had spent years telling herself she was only a killer, only death. But was she? Was she still the girl who had whispered names into the dark, dreaming of revenge? Or was she something else now? The walls trembled, bringing her back to the present. She had no time for questions. She needed to move. The streets of King's Landing awaited, if she could make it that far. Arya moved like a shadow through the ruins of the Red Keep, her body sore, her breath ragged. Every hallway looked the same, filled with smoke, littered with bodies, echoing with the distant screams of the dying. The city she had once dreamed of seeing as a child was nothing but fire and death now. She pushed forward. There was no time to waste. Outside, Drogon's roar cut through the night, followed by another blast of dragon fire. The heat from the streets below rose up, suffocating and relentless. Arya gritted her teeth. If she didn't find a way out soon, she would burn with the city. The ground trembled beneath her feet, stone crumbling, the castle itself breaking apart under its own weight. She turned a corner and stopped abruptly. A group of Lannister soldiers, stood in the hallway ahead, their red cloaks tattered, their faces coated in sweat and grime. They had abandoned their weapons, looking less like warriors and more like desperate men trying to survive. They hadn't seen her yet. For a moment, Arya considered slipping past them. But then one of them turned, and her blood turned cold. Meryn Trant was long dead. Sir Elan Payne was nothing more than a name from the past. But the man standing in front of her now was still very much alive. Sir Gregor Clegane was dead, or at least whatever had remained of him had been dealt with, by his brother. But his second in command, the man who had carried out countless executions in his name, was standing mere feet away. Sir Rolf Westerling. Arya hadn't thought about him in a long time, but now she remembered everything. He had been one of the men who had laughed as Robb Stark's body was desecrated. He had stood beside the mountain when they had rounded up Stark supporters in King's Landing, executing them in the streets like animals. And now he was here. Fate was cruel. Her fingers tightened around the dagger still coated with Cersei's blood. One last name, one last death before she left this burning city behind. She stepped forward, silent as death itself. Arya moved swiftly, her blade ready. The chaos of the crumbling Red Keep masked her footsteps as she closed the distance between her and Sir Rolf Westerling. He stood with his back to her, barking orders at the remaining Lannister soldiers, his voice hoarse from shouting over the destruction around them. "We have to get out of here," he snapped, gripping one of his men by the collar. "There's no more fighting to be done. The Queen is dead." The words sent a cold thrill through Arya. He didn't even know how right he was. She was just a few feet. Away now, one strike, quick, clean. Before she could act, one of the soldiers turned and spotted her. "Who the—" Arya lunged. She moved faster than they could react, her dagger slicing across the soldier's throat before he could cry out. Blood sprayed onto the stone as he crumpled, eyes wide with shock. The others barely had time to draw their swords before Arya was upon them. She twisted, ducking beneath a clumsy strike, driving her blade into another man's ribs. He let out a strangled gasp, dropping to his knees. Sir Rolf turned, his face contorted in confusion before recognition. "Dawned, you," he breathed. Arya didn't respond. She only moved. She feinted left, then darted right, her blade slicing toward his throat. He barely dodged in time, stumbling back over a fallen body. "You little Stark bitch," he snarled, drawing his sword. Arya smiled. "Say my name." She saw the flicker of fear in his eyes. She attacked again, her movements fluid, relentless. Sir Rolf swung wildly, but she was too fast. She ducked, sidestepped, weaving between his attacks like she was dancing. Then she struck. Her dagger plunged into his gut. Sir Rolf let out a choked gasp, his sword clattering to the floor. He clutched at the wound, his fingers slick with his own blood. His knees buckled and he crashed to the ground, gasping for air. Arya knelt beside him, watching as his life drained away. "You don't get to run," she whispered. "Not after what you did." His mouth opened as if to say something, but only blood bubbled from his lips. His eyes flickered, then went still. Another name crossed off the list. Arya stood, stepping over the bodies, and turned toward the exit. The city was still burning and she wasn't done running yet. The streets of King's Landing were unrecognizable. Ash fell from the sky like snow, coating the ruins in a layer of gray. The air reeked of burnt flesh, and the once proud city was nothing more than a graveyard of collapsed buildings and charred bodies. Arya moved through the wreckage, her steps careful, her eyes scanning for any signs of life. People still ran, screaming, searching for shelter that no longer existed. Mothers carried their crying children. Men staggered, wounded, bleeding, lost. But it was too late. There was no salvation here. Daenerys had not just won. She had erased the city. Arya had seen war. She had seen slaughter. But this was different. It was destruction without purpose, without honor. She had come to kill a queen, but the queen she had intended to kill had not been the one who had truly destroyed King's Landing. She clenched her jaw and kept moving. A horse, bloodied and panicked, reared up in the distance before bolting through the streets. Arya's eyes followed it for a moment before her gaze landed on a group of survivors huddled near the remains of a market stall. Their clothes were covered in soot, their faces streaked with tears. She could leave them, she could walk away, but something inside her wouldn't let her. She approached, and the people flinched at the sight of her, wary of anyone who still carried a weapon. "You have to move," she told them. "There's nothing left here." A man, clutching the arm of an injured woman, looked up at her. "Move where?" His voice was raw, broken. "The city is gone." Arya looked toward the distant gates, the only way out of this burning ruin. "North," she said. "There's still safety in the north." The man hesitated, then nodded. He helped the woman to her feet, and the others followed. Arya turned away before they could thank her. She had come to King's Landing with a list of names. Cersei Lannister was dead. Sir Rolf Westerling was dead. Her list was empty now, and yet she didn't feel finished. She found the horse again, still trembling, its dark eyes wild with terror. Carefully she approached, whispering softly as she reached for its reins. It didn't resist. It was too exhausted to fight anymore. She mounted, gripping the reins tightly. The wind carried the scent of smoke and death, the echoes of screams still ringing in her ears. Arya Stark had come here for revenge, but she was leaving with something else. A new purpose. Without another word, she turned the horse toward the gates and rode, away from the ruins, away from the past, and toward whatever came next.